In this lesson, we will look at the power behind connecting Dynamo to an external program such as Excel to be able to extract model data from the Revit environment. To get started, we will open the project document included with the datasets for this lesson. This project is the advanced sample model with a few tweaks made. We can open this by just dragging it onto the home screen or navigating to File, Open, and pointing at the Revit model. Once we have the Revit model open, we can go ahead and take a look at it. As I mentioned, this Revit file contains modifications to a random number of room elements within it. So what I went ahead and did is I have some misspellings purposely put in to this model that we can actually fix. In Revit, room names, or any parameter value for that matter, are not something that you can spell check through the typical user interface in Revit. So for us to be able to add this functionality, we're going to use Dynamo. So in this lesson, we will extract the important room data and write it to Excel, and then spell check in Excel. In a later lesson, we will modify that data and bring it back into Revit from Excel. To get started, we will go ahead and open Dynamo from the Manage tab. We will go ahead and click on New to start a new blank graph, and we'll maximize Dynamo. Once we have a new blank graph, we need to think about the way our graph needs to be built. A helpful way of figuring this out is by thinking of how we would go about this process in Revit through the UI. I previously mentioned that we are looking at room data in Revit, so our first step would be to collect or select all of the rooms. In the Revit UI, we would typically do something like a crossing window selection along with a filter. We could look at that in Revit. So in Revit, we typically do something like this, to where we cross against the model, navigate to filter, and make sure we just have room selected. The problem with this is once we've selected all of the rooms, we can't modify things like room names or room numbers all at once. So that's where Dynamo comes into play. Back in Dynamo, we need to look at how we're going to collect or select all of our rooms in Revit. If we navigate to the Revit category in the library, we'll notice that there's a category called Selection. Let's expand that now. Within the selection category, we have a whole variety of selection methods. This includes everything from singular instance-based selections up to whole collections of elements. For this exercise, we know that we are wanting to work with room elements that are of the Revit category rooms, so a category collection would work. As you can see, we have a node called All Elements of Category, and the description is get all elements of the specified category from the model. Let's place this node now. With the All Elements of Category node placed, let's take a moment to observe its input and description. If we hover over the category input, we can see that the description says the category. In Revit, we have several categories to choose from, and in our case, we're looking at the room category. In order to fulfill this node, we can navigate back to the library, under Selection still, and see that we have a node called Categories. Let's place that node now. The Categories node is a special Dynamo drop-down node that provides access to all the categories available in the active document. We can click on the drop-down and navigate to any category that's available. If we type in the letter R, it will take us to the R section, and we can find rooms. And we'll select rooms now. By selecting rooms in the category dropdown, we can now fulfill the all elements of category input by connecting the output to it. With the all elements of category node fulfilled, we can now preview its output by hovering over the node and pinning its preview. As you can see, we have now collected all the room objects in our Revit model, all in a matter of 2 nodes. With these elements selected, we can now extract data from them. As I mentioned previously, the model provided in the dataset has intentional errors added to the room names, so this would be the first piece of data that we need to obtain. In order to find out what Dynamo can do with room elements, we can navigate back to our Revit category in the library, and we'll just collapse the selection for now. If we navigate to Elements, and we scroll down, we'll see that we have a room category. This category will contain all of the methods that we can apply to room elements within Dynamo. As you can see, we have a variety of elements in here, like setting the name, setting the number, getting the location, things like that. Most importantly, we have a node called name, and the description of this node is get room name. Let's go ahead and place this on the canvas now. With room name place, we can go ahead and drag it to the right of the room elements and fulfill its input. If we hover, we can pin the preview and see that we've obtained the room name from all of the room elements that we previously collected. We have a total of 91 elements, and that's noticeable in the preview as well. Utilizing a lot of these out-of-the-box nodes, we're able to see that we can obtain data very quickly. In our case, we've obtained the room name from the room element with the out-of-the-box node room.name. Before we move on, we need to take a look at how Revit elements behave in Dynamo. You may have previously noticed that Revit elements have a green numeric object in the node preview, and that's right here to the right of the object name. This is known as the Revit element ID. If we tile our Dynamo window next to our Revit window, we can actually see that if we click on these little green element IDs, it will zoom into that element within the Revit window. It'll get it as close as it can. In Revit, all elements have an element ID, and these can be thought of as almost like a phone number of sorts for that element. If we need to interact with these elements, obtaining them with their element ID is a fairly safe operation. As you can see, we have element IDs in the output of the All Elements of Category node. In Revit, if we navigate to the Manage tab, we can navigate to the Inquiry panel and actually select elements by that element ID as well. When you click on Select by Element ID, you can type in an element ID and manually select it in Revit. We need to mimic this interaction in Dynamo just to make sure we're working with the correct elements, and we'll re-maximize Dynamo. The reason I mentioned that obtaining elements by their element ID is fairly safe is because element IDs can change, just like people's phone numbers do in real life. Using element IDs to match elements with their data is very safe in short-term workflows like ours that we're building right now. It is something to keep in mind as you learn Dynamo and expand your skill set. Further exploration would include the utilization of the element's unique ID, which would be the equivalent of something like a social security number for Revit elements. With that understanding of Revit element IDs in place, we can now plan out how to keep track of our elements. Since rooms are Revit elements, we can navigate back to our library under the Elements category. If we scroll up, we'll see that we have another subcategory called Element. If we expand this category, these are operations that are shared across most Revit elements. Since a room in Revit is a Revit element as well, we can use most of these interactions with it. If we scroll down, we'll see that we have an option for ID, and the description is get the element ID for this element. Let's place this node now. Once we have this node placed, we can notice that it'll allow us to obtain the Revit element ID as data that we can use within Excel. Let's go ahead and collapse the room name preview as well. And we'll reposition this to be to the right of the elements and above the room name. And we'll go ahead and connect the output of the All Elements of Category node to the element.id node. If we hover, we can preview what we've obtained, and we do have the element IDs for all the room elements now. With that node connected, we now have the room's names and their element IDs. This will allow us to better track the rooms and push the data to our external source, which is Excel, and it allows us to prepare that data to be able to bring it back into Revit. In order to complete this process to prepare our data for Excel export, let's go ahead and place the node that allows us to export to Excel. We'll navigate back to the library. And I'll go ahead and collapse the Revit category, and we'll look at the category Import Export. Within Import Export, there is an additional category for data. We'll expand that category, and we'll see that we have a node called Export Excel. Let's place this node now. Keep in mind that in order to use the Excel-related nodes, you must have Excel installed on your machine. With the Export Excel node placed, we can now see that we have quite a few inputs to fulfill. Let's take a look at these inputs now. The first input is of the data type string or text and is titled file path. This means that we have to supply a text value that points to a location on disk to be able to save an Excel document. We can do this with a string node, so let's go ahead and search the library for that right now. And we'll place a string node on the canvas. Since we would like Dynamo to create an Excel file from scratch, we can define the full path in this string. For this example, I'm going to place the Excel file in a folder on my desktop. And to make things easy, I'll copy the file path from File Explorer, paste this into the string, and then append my file name to the back. And we'll call it roomdata.xlsx, which is the extension for the Excel file. With that string completed, we can plug its output into the file path input of the data.exportExcel node. The second input on the exportExcel node is titled sheet name, and it's also a string data type. To fulfill this input, we need to tell the node what we want the sheet to be called. By default in Excel, this is typically sheet 1, but using this workflow, we can name it whatever we want. Let's drag this up. We'll copy the string node with a control copy, and we'll change the value to room names. And plug that output into the sheet name input. And now we have the second input fulfilled. The next two inputs are start row and start call. This means that we're going to define the starting row in Excel and the starting column in Excel from the upper left corner. These data types for these inputs are of type integer, which is just a whole number. The easiest way to fulfill this input would be to double-click for a code block, and for now we'll type in 0, just to start at the upper left corner. And we'll plug this output into both of these inputs. The last input on the node would be the overwrite parameter. The default value of this is false. What this input does is it prompts Dynamo to force overwrite the data if it already exists. In our case, we're creating the data from scratch, so we can leave this at the default value for now. For the data input, we need to input all of the data that we want to export to Excel. This would include our room element IDs and the room names. So in order to combine this data, we need to use a list create node. Let's search the library for that now. And we'll place a list create node on the canvas and add one input to it. So we have a total of 2 inputs. In order to combine our data, let's tie the element ID into item 0 and the room name to item 1. With this node fulfilled, we can connect it to the Excel export node. Keep in mind, we are on Run Automatic by default, and we can see this in the lower left corner. This means that the data will export as soon as we connect this node, which is okay for our purposes. Let's connect it now. With that node connected, Excel will launch and you can see all of our room data available. And I'll maximize Excel. In Excel, you can now use functionality that it is great at. You can do formulas and all of these other operations as well. For now, we're simply doing a spell check, so we can go to Review, Spelling, and run through and correct all of the spelling in the document. As you can see, we can go through and spell check all of the room names through Excel's UI. It's nice to use Excel for this because it already has a built-in dictionary for this, and we're able just to use that to our advantage. Go ahead and go through and spell check everything now. With all of the room names spell checked and corrected, we now have access to all of that data to be able to bring it back into Dynamo and Revit and modify it in the Revit environment. Next, we need to look at how to pull this data back into Revit with Dynamo in a very powerful way.